Okay, everybody. Well, welcome to our full board meeting for today. It's nice to see everyone. Why don't we begin just by having the board members do quick introductions? So I'm Steve Raphael, co-chair, board professor of public policy at UC Berkeley and the gubernatorial appointee. And I'll kick it over to my co-chair, Melanie Ochoa.
Hi, this is Melanie Ochoa, she, her. I am Police Practices Director at ACLU SoCal and co-chair. And I'll popcorn it over to Lily Kajabi.
Hi, I'm Lily Kajabi. I'm a professor of mathematics at Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles and an appointee of the Attorney General's office. Can I popcorn over? I see Manjul Kulkarni on my screen.
Thanks, Lily. Hello, everyone. My name is Manju Kulkarni. I'm Executive Director of AAPI Equity Alliance and co-founder of Stop AAPI Hate, calling in from Los Angeles and was appointed by Speaker Rendon. I will turn it over to Sheriff Ayub.
Hi, good morning. I'm Bill Ayub, Sheriff of Ventura County, and I am representing the California State Sheriff's Association. And I'll turn it over to Commissioner Ray.
Morning, everyone. Hi, I'm Amanda Ray, Commissioner with the California Highway Patrol, and happy to be here. That I will turn it over to, I don't know if Nancy Beninati has gone or yet.
Good morning. I am not a board member, but it is great to see you this morning. I'm Nancy Beninati, a supervisor in the Civil Rights Enforcement section. I will turn it over to Rich Randolph.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I am Rich Randolph. I'm a appointee from PORAC, statewide organization. I'm also a police corporal in the Inland Empire, and I'd like to turn it over to Miss Lawanda, very active right now.
Good morning. My name is Lawanda. I'm with a group called Justice for Murdered Children, and we're located in Los Angeles. And I'm going to turn it over to the next board member.
Brian Kennedy. I pastor at Mount Zion Church of Ontario in Inglewood. Nice to be here. Miss Taylor.
Hello, good morning. My name is Tamani Taylor. I am moving over to the San Francisco Public Defender's Office as an assistant public defender. I represent the California Public Defenders Association. And I don't know who else is left. I'll pass it over to the next person, the next board member.
I think that's everybody.
I think that's everyone. All right, well, welcome everybody, and thank you again, DOJ staff, for putting everything together for this meeting. And we have a pretty full agenda, including a couple of guest presenters and speakers who have done analysis using RIPA data and other sort of similar data collected by California agencies. And we have updates from committees, and then ultimately we're also going to discuss the 2023 report and take care of a few other things. So why don't we begin? We have a pretty busy day. We'll take a break at 12:15 for 15 minutes, but we're just going to start by marching through the agenda. So why don't we start by reviewing the minutes from the March 30th, 2022 meeting. And let's take a few minutes to do that. And then if there are any amendments, we'll entertain those suggestions. And if there's a motion to approve, we'll also do that.
I move to approve the minutes. This is Board Member Andrea Guerrero.
This is Melanie Ochoa.
Okay, so we have a motion to approve in a second. All in favor of approving, I guess say aye. We can just do or raise your hand. Anyone opposed? Okay, it's unanimous. So our meetings are approved. So next we have an update from the Department of Justice.
Good morning, everyone. Before we do our update, I would like to introduce or reintroduce Damon Brown, who is our Special Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights. I think we've met Damon previously, but I just wanted to introduce him this morning as he is a very valuable member of our team. I think one of the updates, I think Allison was going to give the main updates. I do want to let you know that the regulations have been submitted to the Office of Administrative Law, and we are waiting for their approval. We, as you probably saw after the last main board meeting, we resubmitted them for a second public comment period, which was in response to questions that the Office of Administrative Law had previously had about those regulations. The vast majority of those regulations, the data elements, will be, we asked for them to be effective on January 1st of 2024. And we did ask that the researcher piece, requests by researchers for the full set of data, be made effective upon filing with the Secretary of State. So, so we're really excited about that, and I'm waiting on pins and needles for those to be approved. And now I'll just turn it over to Allison.
Good morning, everyone. It's great to have all of you here. I'm going to turn it over to Erin Choi in a few minutes to talk about updates on the data. Just wanted to sort of situate us with where we are with the report and all of the meetings. We've just finished a series of 5 subcommittee meetings for all of the subcommittees. And through those meetings, we've developed some of the content for the report. So what you all see now is a rough draft of some of the sections of the report. It is a rough draft. The sections are still in development. We're still doing research and talking with experts, but we wanted to send the board what was done so far so you all could have an opportunity to comment on the sections that have been written so far. We're really excited about the presentations that we're going to have today that will talk more about how researchers and organizations and academics are using the RIPA data. So we're looking forward to those presentations. And we're looking forward to your feedback on what the report looks like so far. We've noted in the report where there is content being developed, and we are currently working, so you'll all be getting emails from us to set up the next set of subcommittee meetings. As a reminder, the next full board meeting will be October 12th. We've decided in consultation with all of the board members, the governor has the Bagley-Keene open meeting rules, the suspension to those rules has been reinstated. And so after polling all of the board members, we've decided to hold the meetings virtually until further notice. So we hope that will help participation from the board members and members of the public. And so the next full board meeting will be October 12th. And until then, we'll be working with all of you to schedule the next set of subcommittee meetings. So that's the main DOJ update from the Civil Rights Enforcement section, and now I will turn it over to Erin from Client Services Program. Thank you. Erin, you are muted.
sorry, I had myself on double mute. I really wanted to make sure you didn't have to hear my dogs in the background. So good morning, everyone. My name is Erin Choi, and I just want to say first and foremost, thank you for this opportunity to connect with you all this morning. I am going to start sharing my screen just so we have an opportunity to go through some updates. But I work in the part of Cal DOJ, specifically with the agencies as they collect and transfer their STOP data into our statewide repository, which is also known as the STOP Data Collection System. There are a couple of updates I wanted to share with you today, and you'll see those listed on the screen. But to get things started, I wanted to provide a quick recap of, what's been going on, where we've been, where we're at, and then looking ahead for the data submissions. So here's a quick snapshot of the incoming records for this year of 2021, the work that's being done to analyze the records. It will cover 58 agencies, which was up from prior year of 18. As far as publishing stands for 2022, as of Monday, we have over 400 agencies that have already started submitting their records into the state repository for this year. And I took a peek at the numbers again this morning, and it's actually close to 450 agencies. And so it is fluid. It's changing on a daily basis. We have an additional 10 agencies that are in progress of submitting records. So the current count in the state repository is just over 950,000 records that have been submitted. So as we look ahead through the end of the year, we anticipate receiving data from over 500 agencies. So it's going to be an almost tenfold increase in reporting agencies now that the reporting requirement is in effect statewide. So we're at about 80 to 90% of those agencies have already started some form of submission. And based on the legislative requirement, it is up to the agencies submitting daily, weekly, biweekly, monthly, all across the spectrum. And we do have some that have indicated that they're going to be doing just an annual submission closer to the deadline next April. But our team has been focusing on outreach and error resolution as our top priority. We want to try to help ensure that there aren't going to be any surprises when agencies submit their data. And by reporting early, we hope to identify any technical or transmission issues and have time to work with agencies through those. So since we last met, there have also been a number of other activities in progress. And some of those key items are shown there on the screen. We hosted 6 lessons learned sessions with reporting agencies, targeting those that were most recently onboarded as of January 1. We had already been having regular check-in meetings with them one-on-one, but we wanted to bring them together in groups of agencies so they could share information, we could receive their feedback, and vice versa. We also had a dedicated session to meet again with all of the vendors that work with agencies on their RIPA data submissions. And this series of meetings just wrapped up on June 30th. As an example of some of the things that were addressed in those sessions, part of the discussion with each group centered on data reporting, especially regarding incidents that involved discharge of a firearm and how agencies' RIPA data may compare to similar data reported to the department in the use of force data. So we discussed various scenarios with them and just wanted to make sure that agencies were on the same page about how there would be anticipated overlap between the discharge firearm data in RIPA and other use of force data coming in. I know the data subcommittee briefed the board on that topic when you all last met in March, and I just want to reiterate that this is something that we are actively working on and approaching from a number of different angles. We're also continuing our focus on outreach and error resolution by updating and developing a number of new resource materials. For example, we just released an updated error report, breaking down some validation errors to try to streamline things for the agencies and their vendors. And we have some other things in the works, some additional FAQ documents, quick reference guides, as well as an information bulletin, which is a type of communication that the department periodically sends out to the head of each agency when we want to bring things to their attention. And then last but not least, we also are gearing up for changes that are coming in the pending regulations that Nancy mentioned. For the area that my program works on, we'll start helping to coordinate the technical changes that will be made to the statewide system and preparing agencies for changes to their local system, conducting testing with them and training. So there's a lot going on. I know you have a full agenda, but we just to share some of those highlights with you. And with that, I'll just pause to see if you have any questions, feedback, if anything else would be helpful right now.
Sure, thank you. Do any board members have questions? I guess seeing none, I do have one question. I wanted to ask about the role of vendors in helping collect the data. Do the vendors mainly create apps for officers to use to enter the data in, or are they assisting also in the transmission of the data? And I know the DOJ has created an app, I believe, that departments can use automatically. Is that what most of the smaller departments are doing?
Yes, that's right. Most of the smaller agencies, but not all, even some larger agencies like San Francisco PD are using a web application that DOJ hosts. So that allows the officers to enter things more in real time or on a daily basis. But there are also other kind of technical channels that can be used for agencies to transfer the data to us. Most of those agencies that are using a vendor type of system, it is for the officers. Some agencies built something brand new just for RIPA, and others worked with their vendors that already support their local dispatch system or record management system, and they essentially kind of added a RIPA module to that. So it's a variety of different ways that the data can come in, and we try to just adapt to whatever the agency needs. So we try to keep open lines of communication with the vendors and be a resource for them as well. It's kind of a joint partnership. If the agency has elected to use vendor software, then we want to make sure that it's going to be successful too.
Okay, thank you, Erin. Are there any questions from board members for any of the updates?
Steve, I have one more update before we dive into our guest speakers. I do want to introduce the board to two new RIPA board team members who are going to be working with you all full time. I think you've met some of them, both of them maybe at the subcommittee meetings. But Jennifer Solomon started at DOJ in April. She comes to us from the New York District Attorney's Office, and we're really glad to have Jennifer. And we also have Yasmin Manners, who has been with the DOJ in the correctional law section for a couple of years, and she has transferred into the civil rights enforcement section in July. So we're really pleased to have both of them, and you will be working with them on the various sections. And then I also just want to give a shout out to our two awesome interns from this summer, Lauren O'Grady and Caroline Hunsicker. They really helped and did a lot of research and helped get this report, draft report, into shape. And so I just want to acknowledge them and thank them. They will be heading back to law school, so we wish them well. And we're really excited now, I think, to finally get to the main event of the day, the speakers. Steve?
Thank you, Nancy. I guess William Marmeline joined. Do you want to introduce yourself really quick?
Hey, yeah, Will Armeline. I'm director of the Human Rights Institute at San Jose State, criminal justice chair for NAACP of Silicon Valley, San Jose. Sorry again, I just had some link problems.
Okay, great. Thanks, Will.
Steve,
All right, so
Steve,
I'm sorry.
Ronnie, I believe Ronnie is also on the line, was able to
Oh,
join
okay.
late, and I don't know, and also Andrea joined a little bit late as well. So I just want to make sure everyone knows all of the board members who are present.
Okay. Andrea and Ronnie, want to introduce yourselves?
Andrea Guerrero from Alliance San Diego. Good morning.
Hello, everybody. Good morning. Ronaldo Villada, Executive Director of Groups for Justice.
Great. Welcome, everybody. Okay, so let's move on to our guest speakers for today. So we have three different guests that are joining us today from first, Public Policy Institute of California, Neighborhood Legal Services of LA, and the Center for Policing Equity. So I have in the order in the list that we're going to start with PPIC, and or Dr. Deepak Premkumar is here to present to us. Good morning, Deepak. And so the floor is yours. Do you want to share your screen?
Yeah. Can everyone see this and hear me?
Yes.
Awesome. That's great. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you again for your service working on the RIPA board. I'm excited to present today about how PPIC is using RIPA data and research, and then the general benefits of RIPA data. I'm Deepak Premkumar, as Steve mentioned, and I'm a research fellow in criminal justice. So before I get into how instrumental RIPA data is and how it'll be a comprehensive source for stop data, I first have to give you context in what research has done previously. So there's been a lot of interest in understanding police-civilian interactions and stops and racial disparities and policing practices generally. And there's been a large focus on trying to use stop data for that purpose, but researchers over the last 2 decades have had to rely on large local law enforcement agencies or a state patrol to do their analysis. And that's been somewhat limiting to draw broader truths about policing because there's always the concern that the data is not representative to a broader population. And in the last 5 years, the information on police stops has greatly improved with efforts by the Stanford Open Policing Project, which in 2015 started sending out Public Records Act requests to law enforcement agencies across the country. They eventually reached 29 state patrols and 29 municipal police departments, covering over 100 million stops across the country. And that was a way to really generate information that covers a broad swath of the country. But in terms of state level laws that cover the full set of law enforcement agencies, RIPA will be kind of relatively unique across the country. As of 2019, there are only 3 states that had these so-called comprehensive laws, meaning that California, along with Illinois and Oregon, were the only states that collected and mandated vehicle and pedestrian stops. There were 20 states that required vehicle stops, but not a lot of these states have some of the public data portals from Open Justice that break down the states in terms of perceived identity traits, as well as stop outcomes and experiences, and those that do tend to be smaller. So California participating in this through the RIPA law is truly transformative for what we know about criminal justice. So as I mentioned, there's been a lot of excitement around the RIPA data law, and one reason is it contains the most detailed set of data on traffic stops. So the NYU Policing Project did an analysis of all state legislation related to police stops, and they found that RIPA contained the most information on both the stop experiences and the perceived identity of the person stopped. And then eventually, I believe April 2023 was the last wave, will contain a full set of agencies that exist within the state, which will be incredibly informative because at this point, stop data is probably the farthest upstream we'll get on criminal justice contact. So when we think of the extent to which the criminal justice system plays in the broad societal role, stop data is probably the farthest upstream we can get, which is both important to know, but also it also serves as another reference point when it comes to assessing disparity, because it gives us a sense of the amount of people that law enforcement interacts with somewhat regularly. Now, in the last 5 years or so, there's been a lot of legislation related to policing and racial disparities, both at a local and state level. And these policy discussions work on lessening racial disparities while still promoting public safety for both officers and civilians. And this RIPA data can be really informative in understanding these reforms that are being passed at a local and state level and how that shapes police-civilian interactions. Now, LAPD and Berkeley are two places where they've investigated making reforms in this space, and it'll be really important to use data sets such as RIPA to evaluate their effects. Now, PPIC has done a handful of projects in the space. We had two research projects released last October. That's racial disparities in law enforcement stops and police use of force and misconduct. And both of these projects at least partially address racial disparities in both stops, but as well as looking at searches, enforcement, and use of force. All of these things are quite important. We've also taken those insights from those two reports to focus on a current report that should be forthcoming this fall. And we'll be using some of the insights from those two reports to identify racial disparities that were witnessed in the first two and see how it varies across the day and by type of law enforcement agency. And additionally, we also will be doing an examination of racial bias, doing a veil of darkness test, similar to some of the work that the RIPA board is currently undertaking. Now, although the intent of the RIPA law was to examine the extent in which racial and identity profiling exists, the data set is so detailed it can also answer some really fundamental questions about policing generally in the state. So, for example, from numerous conversations we've had with policymakers and practitioners that work in the criminal justice system, one question we've been repeatedly asked is about how police strategies and police-civilian interactions were adapted and shifted during the COVID-19 pandemic. We've heard many reports about how local municipal law enforcement agencies passed things such as cite and release orders or directives suggesting that law enforcement try and reduce police-civilian interactions. But using the RIPA data, we should be able to quantify the extent to which law enforcement agencies truly did change the number of stops they had, or changed whether or not they arrested people versus just giving them a citation or a warning to reduce jail populations for public health reasons. In terms of what our PPIC reports have revealed, a couple of quick highlights from our reports, which likely won't surprise you because they largely reflect the results of other RIPA board reports, is the RIPA data reveal disparities in stops as well as searches and experiences during the stop. So, for example, Black Californians are more than twice as likely to be searched than white Californians, but those searches are less likely to yield contraband and evidence. And this potentially points to an inefficiency in targeting individuals for searching. And that may be further bolstered when looking at other suggestive evidence, such as Black people being overrepresented in stops not leading to any enforcement, where enforcement's defined quite conservatively as a civilian receiving at least a warning. And then finally, we see that Black people are overrepresented in use of force relative to their population share. And again, using the demographics of the municipality in which the stop takes place is relatively controversial in that there's a lot of discussion of what the appropriate benchmark is. Some feel like, especially for vehicle stops, perhaps a more appropriate benchmark would be commuting population, or if a lot of the stops are taking place in a particular neighborhood, using those demographics rather than the broad city. When comparing stop outcomes, like beyond stops, looking at searches and other experiences, having stops, just the extent and demographics of those stopped as a benchmark to evaluate those stops outcomes is quite useful and definitely will be helpful for further analyses going forward. So aside from using a general benchmark such as stops, we see that there are racial disparities, but we can conduct more rigorous analyses. So in our reports, we've conducted regression analyses that allow us to control for perceived traits of the individual stopped, the context in which that individual stopped, meaning like the reason for them being stopped. Is it a traffic stop versus there's a warrant out for an arrest, a call for service, whether there was a weapon found? All of these things should change the stop experience. However, we definitely see when controlling these factors that the racial disparities that we witnessed earlier narrow quite substantially, but they still persist. And not only do they persist for Black individuals, they persist for most communities of color, and with Black individuals having the most substantial racial disparities. When trying to dig in further to see where are these racial disparities coming from, we find that racial disparities are largest when looking at traffic stops of local law enforcement agencies. Now, this is a place where we discuss in the report as a potential place to reduce stops for non-moving violations, if we can do that without compromising public safety or traffic safety. There's definitely been a lot of discussions post-COVID around increases in vehicle deaths and traffic safety generally. 2/3 of the stops, traffic stops, are for moving violations, which leaves about 1/3 of them for equipment and non-moving violations, with the most common reason being stopped for like improper display of a license plate. And through our discussions with law enforcement practitioners, we discussed as that potentially being a place where these stops can be reduced or shifted in how they're done. And we're seeing this reflected in other law enforcement policy changes across the state. For example, the San Francisco police chief suggested perhaps ticketing drivers by mail or leaving on their car instead of stopping them. LAPD has talked about policies that limit the use of these more minor traffic stops. So that's something to explore in the future. We're currently undertaking a report to explore where these racial disparities in traffic stops exist most prominently. Is it during a certain time of day? And perhaps are there particularly times during the day when these inefficient practices are highest? So that's definitely something we'll release that report in the fall, and something we look forward to discussing with stakeholders in the space. Now, unsurprisingly, we believe the confidential RIPA data could add further insights. I'm not positive, but I believe the RIPA board has access to this data, but general researchers currently, we have not had a chance to get access, but I think it's been mentioned that the DOJ is starting that process. There's a few data variables that are incredibly important for research, particularly getting a more granular sense of where the location of the stop is. One, it allows us to give us a sense of what the policing strategies are. Crime tends to be pretty concentrated within a municipality, and as a result, typically policing resources are as well. Being able to spatially map that and see where these stops are taking place allows us to get a sense of are they happening across the city or are they concentrated against a few neighborhoods? Furthermore, understanding things about how concentrated these racial disparities are, whether they're being generated by a few officers or uniform across the agencies, has important implications for whether a law enforcement agency chooses to do a department-wide training or just send a few officers to do some procedural justice training, for example. And then finally, understanding how officer experience or assignment play a role is incredibly important. Economics research has identified that police officers over time typically get better at assessing who should be stopped and who should be served. The RIPA data, which will eventually cover all California agencies. So having that information is incredibly valuable to understanding how these racial disparities get created in the first place. And then finally, I wouldn't be a researcher if I didn't believe that more data could improve decision making. Erin Choi presented earlier about potential additions of data elements, and they've been discussed and potentially added. To a few elements that I found that could be quite important going forward are de-identified information on officer demographics or trainings. It's definitely relevant when considering initiatives such as in Sacramento PD of trying to diversify their law enforcement agency, or agencies undertaking certain types of trainings such as trainings on the new standard for deadly use of force, trying to understand how that changes officer behavior and then police-civilian interactions generally. It'll be incredibly important to have that information so we're able to evaluate some of the state legislature's bills and see how that affects stop and search behavior. I want to just thank you for your time, and if there are any questions, I'm happy to stop and answer them. If we don't have time, feel free to shoot me an email or give me a call at that number. Thank you so much for having me present. I really appreciate all of your time.
Deepak, are there any questions from board members for the PPIC researchers? Not hearing any. Deepak, thanks for that.
Can we get the contact info put back up?
Oh, I'm sorry.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Could we get his contact info put back up one last time? I wasn't able to get it down, please.
Sure. Deepak, could you put your contact info, just share the screen one more time? Or maybe what we could do, oh, there we go. Okay, thank you.
Perhaps, Deepak, if you're willing, perhaps we could add it to the chat as well.
Yeah, I'll add it to the chat now.
Great, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Deepak. Next, we have a presentation from Neighborhood Legal Services of Los Angeles. And we have two presenters. So joining us today is Chelsea Helena, staff attorney, Neighborhood Legal Services, LA County's Education Rights Practice, and Professor Stephen Graves, Professor of Geography in the Department of Geography and Environmental Sciences at Cal State University, Northridge. Welcome. Thanks for coming.
Hi, everybody. Can you all see my screen?
Yes.
Perfect. Hi, all. Thanks for inviting us to be here and for making RIPA data available to the public. It's been a transformative advocacy tool. My name's Chelsea Elena. I'm an attorney with Neighborhood Legal Services of Los Angeles County in our education rights practice. And I'll throw it to Professor Graves to introduce himself.
Hi, I'm Steve Graves, a professor of geography and GIS at Cal State Northridge, which is in the San Fernando Valley of Los Angeles.
And we're here today to share how we've used RIPA data in our legal advocacy work in the Antelope Valley, specifically in analyzing and mapping RIPA data for a report that we published back in October called Not Just Stops. There we go. Our report, in short, analyzed the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department's civilian and traffic stops civilian traffic and pedestrian stops in the Antelope Valley. In partnership with Professor Graves and CSUN's Geography Department, we were able to compare RIPA data to data from LASD's own crime databases, as well as data from the U.S. Census, to map law enforcement stops, break them down by race, and analyze the reasons behind the stops. Our analysis found that LASD's policing disproportionately targets people and communities of color. For those of you less familiar with the Antelope Valley, it's a region in North Los Angeles County located about 70 miles north of the city of LA. It's colored on the map there in orange. It's home to about 370,000 residents, most of whom live in the cities of Lancaster and Palmdale. And it's patrolled by the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department's Lancaster and Palmdale stations, which are currently being monitored by the Department of Justice due to an investigation that found that the department was engaging in racially biased policing in the region. The Los Angeles County Sheriff's AV deputies have been in the news a lot in the past 2 years. After the suspicious hanging death of Robert Fuller and many of the protests that were happening in the region and nationwide in 2020, my team started looking into RIPA data to understand AV policing and its impact on the communities that we worked in. The Antelope Valley is and has historically been a racially segregated area. Because NLSLA's education and reentry practices focus almost exclusively on the Antelope Valley, we wanted to map the contact data to determine if LASD was targeting some communities for police activity more than others, and whether it could be shown that LASD was making policing determinations along racial lines, as these determinations were impacting our clients and our community partners. Thanks to CSUN, we were able to see where LASD was stopping AV residents and the demographic makeup of those communities. This is a map from our report that shows the racial demographics of the Antelope Valley region. The darker blue an area is, the higher concentration of people of color that it has, according to data gathered from the U.S. Census and the American Community Survey. Before we get into the maps, I just wanted to provide a context for how the data sort of broke down along racial lines. What we saw when we analyzed the data was that in 2019, it would have been statistically expected for Black AV residents, who represent about 17% of the populations of Lancaster and Palmdale, to be subjected to about 17% of traffic and pedestrian stops. Instead, they were 33% of LASD stops, nearly twice their expected share. White residents, on the other hand, were stopped at 14% below their population statistically expected rate. This group was also detained, searched, handcuffed, cited, and arrested at higher rates than any other race, often more than all other races combined. Really, the policing data that we looked at related to Black residents was grossly disproportionate in every category we analyzed. I'll let Professor Graves explain this slide.
Well, this slide is in terms of the total number of observed and expected. It's an elaboration or a different version of the pie charts we just looked at.
And what it shows, and really what our report concluded, was that Black individuals were stopped 136% more than what would be statistically expected for their population size. So you can see that Black residents were the only population group where the lighter bar for observed stops exceeds the darker bar for expected stops. Professor Graves, do you want to talk through this map?
Yeah, so what we wanted to do was to layer, use the GIS, the Geographic Information Systems tools, to layer multiple data sets over top each other so that we could see the relationship between stops, arrest data, other sort of criminal data, and then the local demographics. And this is just an example of a point layer of non-traffic contacts with the graduated point symbol over the demographic, the ethnic map of the area.
So zooming in a bit more, this is one of the maps from our report. It's a map of Lancaster, and it shows the points of non-traffic contact between LASD and the public. These are then layered over the racial demographics of the region's census blocks to show which communities are more heavily impacted by LASD contacts. The area circled in yellow has an overall population of 1,461, a population density of 5,774, and a median income of just under 60,000. 47% of those who live in this area are white, while only about 14% are Black. The area circled in green has a smaller population of just over 1,100, a lower population density of 3,800, and a much lower median income of $25,096. There is a much higher concentration of Black residents in this area at about 33%, and a much lower concentration of white residents at about 17%. These two areas are separated by only 1 mile. However, the rate of non-traffic LASD contacts for these two areas are very different. The rate of contacts in the yellow area is 433 contacts, while the rate of contacts in the green area is 3,391. Although these two areas are nearly the same size and the yellow area has a larger population and population density, it has a contact rate that is nearly 785% less than the contacts in the green area. What is likely contributing to these disparities present in police contacts in these two communities is the fact that the yellow area has 358% more white residents and a median income that is more than double that of the green area. I'm an education rights attorney, so this fact was particularly alarming for me. Of the 20 census blocks in the Antelope Valley with the highest contact rates, 9 of them contain or directly border K-12 schools, with the area that has by far the highest contact rate being the area that contains Antelope Valley High School. Blocks containing K-12 schools are shown here in purple. All right, Professor Graves, you want to talk us through these next couple maps?
Sure. So as Deepak mentioned earlier, the use of sort of raw population data, just how many Black folks live in a census tract, or Hispanics or white people, is controversial, and then there is some difficulty with assuming, making too many assumptions. So we went with another strategy to get a better idea of what might constitute over-policing or perhaps under-policing of a neighborhood. So we took 3 years of LA Sheriff Department data that they serve on their website, and we mapped it, and we pulled out just 2 major subgroups of crime: assault, and then we calculated a rate for assault, and then burglary, all of which has, maybe between 10 and 100,000 incidents over a 3-year period, so we could get a running average over 3 years. And then we compared that then to the stop or contact data. So the presumption of doing that, and we can stop right here because this is zoomed in, is that the local residents presumably would prefer or would expect more contacts in the neighborhoods that suffer the most from either these violent crimes, assaults, or property crimes. And that we use that as a metric to gauge what would one expect. So in a higher crime neighborhood, you would expect more police activity, more contacts, more stops, and in the lower crime areas. And indeed, in much of the study area, as you see in yellow, that the contact rate per person was roughly equal to the expected contact rate based on the RIPA data. But there were a few parts of Lancaster and Palmdale where the contact rate was far in excess of what one would expect given the local assault rate or burglary rate. Interestingly enough, most of these areas were adjoining. If you go back one, Chelsea, that they adjoined the areas that appeared to be most under-policed. And some of the areas that had actually the highest assault rate or burglary rates were some of the most under-policed. And some of the most over-policed areas were places that the crime rate just didn't seem to warrant that many contacts. So, and what we found was that sort of in the heart of the ethnic neighborhoods, the communities of color, those were the areas that seemed to be under-policed most. And in the areas where the communities of color bordered the wider neighborhoods, those were the areas that seemed to be over-policed, both based on the violent crime rate and the property crime rates. And we thought that that was kind of a very interesting revelation from the data. So back to you, Chelsea. This is another map where just sort of showing the areas, these border areas that fit our definition of over-policing.
There are several other, I think, are very interesting maps that are in our report. We just pulled a couple of them, but the report is linked in the presentation if you'd like to see more. In terms of the community impact of this report, we worked really closely with community groups, both in the creation and publication of this report. Two of these groups canceled the contract, and its youth development project, Freedom Arts Squad, have drawn from the data and maps in speaking at school board meetings, questioning sheriff's candidates, conducting community Know Your Rights presentations, and coordinating efforts in communities they know through the maps are more impacted by policing. Local high school students through the Freedom Arts Squad have also been creating absolutely spectacular pieces of art as part of their advocacy for an end to police violence and brutality in their communities. I included some of their examples here. That concludes our presentation. Information on how to access our report is included here. Thanks again for the opportunity to talk about our work in the Antelope Valley, and we would be happy to take any questions if there are any.
Well, thank you, Ms. Elena, and thank you, Professor Graves. It was a great presentation. Do we want to maybe have some quick questions now? While things are fresh in mind? I do have one question. Oh, thank you, Luanda. Luanda, would you like to ask a question? Board Member Hawkins?
Board Member Hawkins, I'd just like to make a comment. I think it was an awesome presentation. I was pleased to see that RIPA data was being used in the Antelope Valley to analyze what was going on up there, because we hear a lot of complaints coming from the Antelope Valley. We hear a lot of complaints with police brutality from the Antelope Valley with the LA County Sheriff. And so it was good to hear that they were looking at the RIPA data, comparing it to what was actually going on, and seeing where was law enforcement actually at and where it should be. Thank you.
Well, I do have one question for the team. You know, we've talked in the past reports and in upcoming reports about bias by proxy, and this finding of over-policing in the neighborhoods bordering a demographic transition as opposed to under-policing in predominantly Black and Latino neighborhoods. How much of that over-policing is calls for service, and maybe could it be that that's the public in those communities calling more on neighbors that perhaps reside in other communities when they, you know, venture across some sort of boundary? And I know that in RIPA we can distinguish between the officer initiated and those that are responses to calls.
Room's ready.
What I could tell, that it was not calls for service, and we didn't have unlimited budget or time to microanalyze all of the data, but we did make a decision to sort of bundle the stops data as one, or the non-traffic stops as one, and we didn't pick that apart. But it's possible, but I think it's unlikely.
I will say in response, there was a question in the chat from William asking about a possible correlation between the tendency for school zones to have more contact in the presence of SROs. I think that's absolutely true. There's a very large contract that the school district has with the sheriff's department, where they're getting 9+ deputies at $1.9 million a year. And they're also pulling deputies from city contracts with Lancaster and Palmdale as well. And what we have seen with relation to the dynamic between the sheriff's department and school administrators is that there is bias present in officer-initiated contacts with students, but there's also bias present in school administrative referrals to law enforcement. So vulnerable students are sort of being caught in a web of bias with respect to how they're being referred to justice system contact.
Manju?
Yes. So my question is to follow up on that, which is, in those particular schools, are they ones in which there's a higher number or disproportionately higher number of African American students or students of color versus those areas in specific schools in other neighborhoods that have perhaps lower or number of contacts with law enforcement?
Absolutely. I pulled out one high school that had the highest rate of contacts in the entire region. That's Antelope Valley High School. It also has one of the largest populations, I think, if not the largest population of Black students there. There's disparities along racial lines at every single Antelope Valley school. However, the number of police contacts goes down as the number of white students goes up. So there is one particular high school in the Antelope Valley called Quartz Hill, and that's located in the northwest part of Lancaster, which is and historically has been the whitest and wealthiest area. And it's an area where a lot of sheriff's deputies that live in the region also live. There's not a ton of police contacts within that region, but as Professor Graves pointed out, there are a hugely disproportionate number of contacts in the areas surrounding that region and like sort of insulating that community and these students.
Dr. Raphael?
Go for it.
Yes. Okay, so I just wanted to make sure I'm understanding the comparison that you were making with contact rate and crime rate. So you were looking at the RIPA data for the contact rates and then looking at the crime rates in those areas. And if I remember the slide correctly, or the analysis, it was that where there was less crime, you would expect less contact.
Correct.
Okay. And the converse. And I'm just wondering if you how you would respond to another read of that data, which would be that there's less. Wait, let me think about this. So you're saying there's less. Your comparison was there was less contact where there was less crime. Is that right? Or more crime?
Well, our expectation was that you would find the most contacts in the neighborhoods where there was the most crime, and vice versa.
Okay, but could one look at that data and say, well, the reason why there is less crime in the areas where there's more policing is because of that policing? And I guess I'm just trying to see if you were able to isolate causality.
No, we didn't isolate causality with the tools that we had. That would be another set of it's another set of analyses. And so we laid bare our assumptions that in neighborhoods that have, dramatically higher crime rates, you would expect the LA Sheriff Department to contact people for, the sort of things that they're being contacted for. But then in other neighborhoods, you would not expect many contacts because you wouldn't have, I guess, people appearing to do criminal things. It's a real challenge to come up with a metric for what constitutes over-policing. And so this is one of the common strategies. You would expect police contacts in areas that you would get more calls for service from the locals. You would have more suspicious persons or more criminal activity requiring at least a short stop to see, does this person fit a description of somebody who was just reported in a recent assault. And these are non-traffic ones as well. So it's about as good as it can be done, but it is plausible that places that have a great deal of police contact could conceivably drive the crime rate down. But for the most part, the crime rate and the stop rate is exactly what you would expect in most neighborhoods. It only gets off kilter in the communities of color and in the adjacent sort of boundary neighborhoods to those neighborhoods. That's why we think it's a fair way of doing these things, or making that measurement.
Thanks.
If you're muted.
Sheriff Ayub, did you want to ask a question? No? Okay. Well, thank you very much. We appreciate you taking the time and presenting the analysis of RIPA data for the Antelope Valley. Great. So our next presenter will be Hillary Rao and Tracy Kawabata-Perret. I hope I pronounced your names correctly, from the Center for Policing Equity. Hillary Rao is Vice President of Policy and Community Engagement at CPE, and Tracy Kawabata-Perret is the Data Operations Manager for the Data Driven Interventions team at CPE. So thank you very much and welcome to our board meeting.
Thank you so much for having us. I'm sorry, I'm just trying to share my screen. Might take me a minute.
Not working?
I think we might have lost Tracy. Okay, Tracy just messaged me that she got kicked off the call. She's going to try to come back. I'm going to see if I can pull up our slides and keep going. Apologies for the delay.
There we go.
Are we good? Okay. So I will get started and see if Tracy's able to leap in and join us. Thank you so much for giving us the opportunity to present today. It's an honor to speak to the board and also to present alongside our distinguished co-presenters earlier today. As Professor Raphael said, I am Hillary Rao. I'm Vice President of Policy and Community Engagement at the Center for Policing Equity. And Tracy and I wanted to talk a little bit today about how we use RIPA data at the Center for Policing Equity in our efforts to promote equitable public safety. For those who are not familiar with CPE, we are a research and action organization that uses data-driven approaches to address racial injustice in public safety systems. We were co-founded by Dr. Philip Atiba Goff, who is a professor of psychology and African American studies at Yale University, and Dr. Tracy Kesey, who is a 30-year veteran of the Denver and New York police departments. We are deeply immersed in police data every day, and in particular in RIPA data. And we've provided data analysis to local partners, law enforcement agencies, and other community partners in over 30 states, including several partners in California. So we're excited to have the opportunity to talk to you today about our work. And now my slides are sticking too, which is very annoying. I will keep talking. My next slide is an overview of my presenters. So as I mentioned, I lead our policy team at the Center for Policing Equity. So my team's job is really to take the insights of data and translate that into policy action. So we do policy analysis for local departments and cities. We do government advocacy, and we also do white papers and research on best practice. Tracy Kawabata-Perret is the data operations manager for the DDI team. So she does a tremendous amount of work with obtaining and cleaning data for our Justice Navigator product, which we will be talking about more. And my
I'm
slides are
back,
just,
Hillary.
you're
I'm
back.
so
Okay.
sorry about that. I'm actually worried about sharing my screen now. That was probably my worst nightmare of I already hate public speaking, and then it actually booted me off. So would you like me to try and share my screen again? I'm a little bit.
Go ahead. I can try if not, but
Okay. I'll try one more time, and apologies, everyone. Thank you for. Okay, it's going to kick me off if I try to screen share. It must be something about the.
Like to email it to me and I'll share my screen.
That would be amazing. Let me-
Between the three of us, we'll be able to get it on there.
Tracy, I can try one more time on my end as well.
I just sent it to you, Steve, as a direct message.
All right.
Thank you so much. So apologies again. Thank you so much for having us. My name is Tracy Calvada Parrott. I'm a data operations manager on our data-driven interventions team at the Center for Policing Equity. So our team collects department data from across the country. We clean it and turn it into insights accessible to the public. So we do that primarily through a product that launched last year called Justice Navigator. This is publicly available on justicenavigator.org. And this tool is meant to help communities and their policing departments identify and reduce the harmful disparities in policing that are observed. So we do this using a variety of statistical techniques. It's great to see so many of the previous presenters use similar analyses. We do use population benchmarking by neighborhood. As one of the previous presenters mentioned, there's some controversy around using this, especially for vehicle stops. So this is limited to our non-traffic pedestrian stops. And where possible, we also use regression analysis to incorporate and address common questions and confusion. As the previous presenter did, we actually controlled for factors including neighborhood crime and poverty levels, the percent Black population in a given census tract. So when we calculate our disparities in stop rates, we'll use this regression analysis wherever possible. Consistent with previous presenters' findings, when we control for crime and poverty, this does account for some, but never all of the observed disparities that we see. So in cities that we've worked with across the country, this is pretty consistent that those factors do not explain the disparity we see in increased police contact with the community. So on our public website at justicenavigator.org, we have a variety of these infographics designed to be accessible to the public, and we pair them with key insights and recommendations so that communities and departments can take action immediately based on the data that they see here. If you can move to the next slide. So some of the challenges.
Let's see if I can move my slide, Tracy. Oh, there we go.
Oh, yep, great. So some of the challenges that we've faced are, across the nation, of course, is that policing data is really inconsistent. So there are no national standards, as you know. There's bad, outdated software, really lax policies. You might have an officer manually entering codes into a field. So we're dealing with trying to clean that up. Even if they do enter that code correctly, for each department's unique set of codes for, say, search reason or disposition, we then need to develop a custom method to understand that data, to clean it up, to standardize it, and map it to our analyses. So this is incredibly labor intensive. We also see a lack of completeness. So many departments, the chief changes, their systems change, or there's just no enforcement to begin with on entering clean data into the system. So either we'll find that they don't collect the data we need, or they, maybe they'll provide something like stop reason, but they'll give us something like field interview without any further detail. So this is essentially meaningless, right? Because it can encompass so many things. That's not a real reason for stopping someone. Incompleteness in the data is a huge challenge that we face. And for some of our more sophisticated analyses, like the regression analyses, we do need a baseline number of data points in order to draw any conclusions. So if a department doesn't collect data completely or consistently for at least a year or two, we won't be able to provide much useful analysis. A previous presenter mentioned Connecticut, which also has standardized, stop reasons. But for regression analysis, we need to have a large enough jurisdiction or municipality to be able to compare across census tracts. So if you're dealing with a very small town, even if we want to provide some of these insights, we're really just not able to do that kind of analysis for smaller areas. So for somewhere like California, this is really where you can get into really interesting analyses. Next slide, please. So with RIPA data, RIPA compliant agencies give us clean, relatively clean, complete, ready to analyze data. This is a game changer. There are over 500 in California, and great to hear that most of those will have their data submitted by the end of the year. That's very exciting. And it's a huge opportunity to get lots of data insights into the public eye. The standards provided by RIPA also mean that we have just one analysis plan with standardized coding that we can apply to every department's data set. So that saves us hours and hours of work because we know when we receive a specific value from a RIPA compliant agency, we know exactly what that means. We know what that label means and how we can map it into our analyses. Also mentioned, I think, by previous presenters that the RIPA level of detail means we can dig deeper. I think one of the board members mentioned calls for service. This is one of the latest analyses that I believe have yet to launch, but should be soon on the website, as we'll be producing heat maps and choropleths for calls for service, so comparing and overlaying the calls for service that we have subsetted to what we would consider community demand with the actual interactions that we observe for stops and use of force. Additionally, the level of detail means that when we get specific questions from the community, we're able to answer them. So one community we worked with was particularly interested in understanding disparities in pretext stops. And because RIPA provides that reason for stop detail, we could look at low-level violations like equipment stops and registration violations that could be used as a pretext for further police interaction and look at disparities specifically within that subset. So I'm going to hand it back to Hillary to talk a bit about this specific scenario with our partners in San Diego City.
Thank you, Tracy. So I'm going to talk a little bit, as Tracy said, about some work that we did in San Diego, as well as more broadly how we are using RIPA data in our advocacy nationwide. In San Diego, we have a wonderful community engagement department that did wonderful work rolling out our analysis of San Diego PD's police data. They engaged stakeholders in the community as well as local government stakeholders and identified which issues were really priorities for the community. And based on that, they were able to highlight responsive findings from our analysis. If you go to justicenavigator.org and look at any of our analyses, there's a lot of visuals and information to scroll through. So our community engagement team did a great job highlighting the information within our reports that was most responsive to community interests. So as Tracy mentioned, in San Diego, there was really a pre-existing focus and interest in addressing pretextual stops. So our community engagement team helped the community stakeholders they engaged with to identify some of the findings that were most relevant to disparities in low-level stop violations. So this data was then pulled by some of our community partners and cited on their campaign materials. So they were able to use this information to advocate for the sort of change that they wanted to see in their communities. And we continue to be in touch with folks in different communities we've worked with after rollout, and we continue to have folks reach out about the report. So being able to provide this data publicly and analyze it provides a really strong ongoing line of communication with communities we work with. On a broader level, RIPA data has been really foundational in our work to advocate for better police data collection nationwide. When RIPA was first enacted, the Center for Policing Equity developed a guidebook on STOP data collection best practices at the request of the California Department of Justice. This was a project we did in partnership with the Policing Project at NYU. And so the intention of this project was to support compliance with RIPA regulations and to provide guidance on analysis of RIPA data for California agencies, but also to encourage other states and agencies outside of California to improve their STOP data collection. So RIPA continues to provide a model and lessons learned for other state lawmakers and federal agencies that want to increase use of data collection requirements for example, grant compliance. We are on a weekly, if not daily basis, sharing out the guidebook with folks across the country. So the lessons learned and example that's being set in California is having really far-ranging impacts in our data policy advocacy work. We're also using a lot of RIPA data and data that's similar in other places to look at public safety redesign projects. So we believe that data analysis is important to help cities reduce the footprint of law enforcement, not just to address disparities in existing systems, but also to think more broadly about what systems could be and could look like. So with good data analysis and of information like we have in RIPA, we can identify types of enforcement that are most disparate. When coupling RIPA data with calls for service information, we can identify enforcement patterns that don't align with public safety needs. And we can adopt evidence-informed policy approaches to regulate policing and support alternative response systems. Pretextual stops is an area that we've been doing a lot of work in on my team recently. So the next step after data analysis for us is always the policy takeaway. So we've been doing a lot of work uplifting things that are happening around the country with respect to strategies to address pretextual stops. So for example, we see that in states like Washington, although they've walked it back recently, there have been outright prohibitions on pretextual stops. There are agencies that have prohibited consent searches or that have limited them. States like Oregon that have restricted questions unrelated to the original stop reason without independent suspicion. And states like Virginia and cities like Philadelphia and Pittsburgh that have prohibited stops based solely on low-level equipment and registration violations. So as these types of interventions and policies are increasingly being adopted around the country, and hopefully additionally in California, RIPA data and data that is similar to it provides an amazing opportunity to track the effects of these types of policies so that we can see what is most effective in reducing disparities in all enforcement, and particularly in some of the low-level enforcement that's particularly of concern to communities. So this is one example of the type of interventions that we would love to be able to track going forward using some of the data that is available using RIPA. So with that, we have gotten to the end of our slides. Thank you for bearing with us through technical difficulties, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Hillary and Tracy. Are there any questions from board members? Okay, well, thanks for the report, and we will all read it. And it's great to see 3 examples of the data being used. And what's being learned. I mean, of course, the detailed dives in individual departments are, we think, something that should be happening. You know, our annual report is an annual report of what's happening at the state overall, but being able to match to census data and look at geography and link to other sources of information on the department's webpage, I think, is a real productive step. So I'd like to thank all the
Steve, I got a question.
Mm-hmm.
When can one expect, one person from the public can expect this data to become policy?
Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Davis. I have to ask that we will have a public comment period, and so if we could just
Oh,
hold
sorry.
those, and so that's okay. If we can hold those and it's a little bit after our break. So and please pose that question to us. Okay, everybody. So we have scheduled a 15-minute break, and I'd like to thank all our presenters for coming today and taking the time. Why don't we break for 15 minutes? We're going to get back. And if I could ask everybody just to be sure to read the letter prepared on AB 2547, because we will discuss that later. And Commissioner member, our board member Ochoa is going to lead the second half of the meeting. So let's all reconvene at, let's say, 12:45, and we'll be right back.
folks. It's 12:46. Just checking to see if folks are back. Okay. If you are a board member and you're here, if you can go back on camera just so I can get a sense of whether folks are back yet or if we should wait a few more minutes. Okay, if folks are here, then I think I'll go ahead and move us forward. We're a little bit behind schedule, so I want to dive right in. And I know we have a lot of substantive discussion in this latter half of the meeting. So thank you for Steve for shepherding us through the first half and all the presenters from DOJ and the researchers who give a lot of helpful information as we move forward. So the first thing up is updates from the subcommittees. I'm going to reorder them a little bit just because we have some substantive things to discuss for the post subcommittee, so I'll move that to the last one. So if there is someone from Civilian Complaints Committee, one of the co-chairs, to do the update in terms of what's going on with y'all.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. This is Allison. I'm going to give the update for the Civilian Complaints meeting since Pastor Kreiner is on a plane and board member Hawkins had to step out for another meeting. So I will give you all a brief update of what the Civilian Complaints Subcommittee discussed. First, the subcommittee had asked the Research Center to present to the subcommittee on agencies that have used deterrent language and how that number, the agencies with deterrent language, how that compares to the number of complaints, civilian complaints those agencies received. And the subcommittee conceived of the deterrent language. We've all discussed, the board has discussed this language from Penal Code 148.6, which requires all complaints include the complainant's signature on the advisory that knowingly filing a false complaint could be subject to prosecution. And so the board has written letters about 148.6 to the legislature. And so the subcommittee had asked the Research Center to report on take a look at the agencies that use deterrent language and look at the number of complaints from those agencies just to see if there were any trends. And, in summary, the deterrent language group of agencies, and this was just agencies from waves 1 through 3, but the deterrent language group of agencies reported less complaints in 2020, which was the year that they examined, and they employed more officers per complaint and made more stops per complaint than agencies with the deterrent language. There are some limitations to that analysis that the Research Center discussed with the subcommittees, including the fact that there is no standardized definition of a civilian complaint, the accessibility of the complaints process, the investigations, and staffing to handle complaints. But that was something that the subcommittee was very interested in. Additionally, the subcommittee got a report on a new appellate case that came down in California, LA Police Protective League v. City of LA. And that case was of concern to the subcommittee because it relates also to Penal Code Section 148.6. And the appellate court in California, as the board has discussed before, there is a conflict. There's currently a conflict between federal and state law over the ability of agencies to remove 148.6 from their complaint forms. And the appellate court in the LA Police Protective League case ruled that 148.6 was not a violation of the First Amendment. So again, the subcommittee discussed and expressed some concerns about this code section, so that there is no longer a conflict. And so the subcommittee will follow that case, to see if there is an appeal and if the subcommittee may want to do anything about that. Lastly, the subcommittee discussed the ongoing research, some of which is included in the rough draft of the board report on the complaints process. And it's a goal of the subcommittee to look at the process holistically from beginning to end and develop best practices to ensure that the process is accessible, fair, and transparent. So to that end, the subcommittee, we presented research to the subcommittee on some best practices around civilian complaints, looking at the intake and access to the process, complaint forms, as the subcommittee has been looking at for the last several years, the timeline for complaints and agencies' handling of those complaints, tracking of the complaints throughout the process, communications with complainants, investigations and audits of those investigatory processes, the dispositions of the complaints, and then early intervention systems and other early warnings about the effect, and how the complaints are being used in discipline processes. So that's the basic summary of what was covered in the civilian complaints meeting, but happy to answer any questions anyone might have.
Thank you, Allison. Are there any questions for the subcommittee? If other board members don't have any, I had a kind of maybe suggestion around the Penal Code 148.6 and the LAPPL case. I know that the City of LA petitioned for rehearing in the Supreme Court. If the Supreme Court does take the case, it's quite likely that it will have a briefing schedule and hear it outside of the time period that we're meeting regularly. So it would be hard for us to vote to engage in that at the time. Given our consistent position on this issue that's been expressed in I think at least 3 reports now, maybe 4, and raising the issues of the impact on the chilling effect that it has on getting these complaints, I think it might be worth authorizing authorizing the civilian complaints co-chairs to perhaps write a letter, an amicus letter, on that case if it gets taken up for review, expressing our already stated position and the data that we've gathered on this issue.
We can definitely take that up with the subcommittee.
I'm sorry. Can I interrupt? Sorry. And Melanie, unfortunately, the board we are not counsel to the board, and therefore we can't provide legal advice or draft an amicus on behalf of the board. If there was somebody potentially that would draft it on behalf of the board and submit that, we can look into that, but we have not. The board's charge is to make recommendations on policy to the legislature, and I would have to even do some research to see if that would extend to drafting an amicus, but that's not something that we can assist with at this time.
So maybe if you look into it and see where we are, if it's a matter of having outside counsel, I'm sure if you're not able to obtain pro bono counsel, I'm sure ACLU would be able to arrange it. But I mean, even for that, in terms of an amicus, it doesn't need to be a legal argument. It's more restating the arguments that we've already raised in our reports, which, again, amicus are not always just presenting legal arguments. So that was the intent that I was expressing.
Sure. I think we can look into it. I But you know, the DOJ, the Attorney General's office, we can only, you know, represent state bodies that we have authorization to represent, and so there is no like mechanism within the RIPA statute for, you know, representation. But even if it would be to file an amicus brief, but I think we can talk about it. It certainly have that discussion, and you know, we understand that this is an important issue for the board, and so there may be other ways to address this.
Okay, so how about we make sure we raise it again on our agenda for the next full board meeting, because I'm sure there won't be any activity prior to that, and we can figure out next steps with some more information. Great. Anyone else on this or anything else for civilian complaints? Okay, so we'll go to the Policies and Accountability Subcommittee.
Yes. All right. Well, thank you. The policy subcommittee met on June 13th, excuse me, and we focused on three things. We focused on the issue of accountability and accountability structures. We focused on youth interaction with law enforcement and on pretextual stops. With regard to the first, on accountability mechanisms, DOJ had presented to us its research on oversight mechanisms, including administrative, criminal, and other independent oversight mechanisms such as civilian review boards. And I think we all noted that it was an important part of accountability to consider RIPA data completion. There have been a number of problems with inconsistencies, inaccuracies, and incomplete data, and we want to make sure that those are addressed as part of the accountability. So I wanted to flag that for the full board, and that we wanted to make sure that accountability addresses the issue of consequences. What happens once we know that there's been misconduct? What are the mechanisms in place to correct behavior or discipline, or even bring criminal charges where that's warranted? With regard to youth interaction of law enforcement, DOJ shared the research it's been doing specifically around school officers, although our focus will be beyond the schools. But with regard to the school officers, DOJ shared the history of school officers in California, which will be in the report, but includes for those who don't know, and if it hasn't been said in a full board meeting before, that school resource officers or school police officers came about as a result of integration and fear of Black students in particular and white schools. And so it is in that context that school policing has arisen, and it is in that context that it continues today. And so the data that we have, it is enough to begin an analysis in that area. And then lastly, around pretextual stops, we heard from Department of Justice their research around how jurisdictions are handling the issue of ending pretext stops. We, in our last report, recommended that to the legislature that we look for ways to end pretext stops. That was echoed in the President Biden's executive order on accountable law enforcement and policing. And the issue may turn on definition of what a public safety stop is. A pretext stop is a non-public safety stop. How public safety is defined varies by police agency, and so it may be what we could contribute to the conversation are best practices around ending pretext stops, model policies, perhaps legislative recommendations that are more concrete, and new approaches to addressing issues around the non-public safety concerns, such as registration, licenses. Those would be like classic non-public safety issues that would fall in the realm of pretext stops. That's it. Back to you, Board Chair Ochoa.
Thank you, Andrea. Any questions for the? Thank you. So let's skip over post for now and go to the calls for service subcommittee.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm going to be reporting back on the meeting that we held on June 21st. So folks may remember that the calls for service subcommittee has been interested in a while in understanding the outcomes related to critical response teams, the critical intervention teams, and crisis response teams. And we've also been interested in issues around bias by proxy and mental health related calls for service. And so we had two presentations at that meeting, one provided by the Street Crisis Response Team, SCRT, within the San Francisco Department of Public Health. And really looking at it in terms of the alternative approach that it provides in times of behavioral health crises. And so the staff member, Kathleen Silk from SCRT, talked to us about how individuals can reach out to SCRT through 911 and that calls are directed through the police dispatch system. Currently, the response team is made up of 3 members. That is a fire department, community paramedic, a behavioral health clinician, and a peer counselor. Additionally, there is a separate team that SCRT has launched called Office of Coordinated Care. And they're really to provide care coordination during that 24 to 48 hour period that immediately follows a crisis situation. Ms. Silk talked to us about the volume of calls. Those have steadily increased since the program began. They've responded to over 10,000 calls, and in only 2% of the time have police had to respond additionally to the location because of any issues related to escalation or active violence. And generally, those that involve active violence are not referred to SCRT. What we also, when we were able to talk about some of our questions, they revolved around, community outcome measurements and whether there are decreases in crime or the use of force. We also talked about outreach endeavors and additionally cost savings that come from use of SCRT as opposed to law enforcement. We then moved on to the topic of POST and the public safety dispatcher course. Because of course, with issues around dispatchers, there are questions about implicit and explicit bias. And unfortunately, the safety dispatcher course has not been updated since 2010. This is what all dispatchers are required to complete within the first year of being hired. It consists of 14 learning domains requiring a minimum of 120 hours to be taught. So now that they are updating the training, they're looking at these various modules or learning domains, including telephone technology,